A well with no shadow, a stick with a shadow, one estimated distance between them, and from that, the circumference of the entire Earth. Over 2,000 years ago, Eratosthenes used shadows and geometry to estimate the size of our planet. This was done without satellites, without seeing the world from above. At Syene, the midday sun at the summer solstice was said to shine straight down. In Alexandria, at that same moment, a vertical stick cast a measurable shadow. That angle, combined with the distance between the two cities, let him scale up to the circumference of the Earth itself. But that feat points to a much bigger mystery. If ancient and medieval people could not see the world from above, how did they draw a map at all? How did they know where to go in travel or war? And hardest of all, how did they draw a coastline, something too long, too irregular, and too deadly to get wrong when no one could ever see the whole shape at once? That was the trap mapmakers lived inside for thousands of years. You cannot see what you are drawing. You can only measure what you can reach, time what you can travel, compare what other people tell you, and hope the errors do not multiply. If the map is wrong, ships miss landfall, armies lose direction, and travelers die far from where they thought they were. Every map drawn before satellites was an act of reconstruction, a guess corrected by measurement, a coastline built piece by piece, a world assembled from fragments of other maps or knowledge from past generations. This is how they did it. Long ago, mapmaking already had two faces. One face was symbolic. On a Babylonian clay tablet, the world could appear as a disk ringed by water, a statement about order, identity, and the edge of the unknown. The other face was a measurement, because if you want a map to behave, if you want it to actually work, you need repeatable steps. You need distances, directions, and some way to turn the ground into numbers. In early societies, that often began with very small things. A field, a canal, a city wall, a boundary that had to be taxed, defended, or disputed. A scribe or surveyor could mark lines on clay or another surface, note lengths in standard units, and turn lived space into a simplified plan. That sounds modest, but it is the beginning of everything. Before you can draw a continent, you first have to learn how to draw a field. The Greeks pushed the problem much further. A field is local. The Earth is not. Latitude was the easier breakthrough. If you measure the height of the sun at noon, or the height of a known star above the horizon, you can begin to estimate north to south position. The sky becomes a measuring tool. A shadow is no longer just a shadow, it becomes location. And then came Eratosthenes. His method is still startling, because it feels impossible and obvious at the same time. If the sun's rays are effectively parallel, then the distance between the sun angle at Syene and Alexandria reflects the curvature of the Earth itself. 1/50th of a circle in angle meant 1/50th of the whole Earth in distance. The leap was extraordinary. He did not just measure land, he measured the planet. But the triumph had a limit, and that limit would haunt mapmakers for centuries. Longitude was the nightmare. North to south position could be estimated from the sky. East to west position was a problem of time. To know how far east or west you are, you have to compare local time with the time somewhere else. And in antiquity, there was no reliable portable clock for that. So east to west position had to be patched together from travel times, itinerary distances, eclipse reports, sailing estimates, and second-hand claims. It was the weakest line in ancient geography, and it stayed weak for almost 2,000 years. That patchwork was sharpened by Ptolemy. In his geography, he treated map-making as a construction problem. Gather coordinates, set a grid, choose a projection, and place the world within that framework. He recorded thousands of locations by latitude and longitude. You could build a map inside rules, then argue about the data point by point. Rome worked at a different scale. Roman surveyors were not trying to solve the whole Earth in one sweep. They were trying to make land ownable, taxable, divisible, and defensible. Their tools, like the groma, helped lay out straight lines and right angles across real landscapes. Measure first, record immediately. Turn ground into property, and property into plan. And that reveals an important divide. Land could often be measured in pieces: a road, a field, a frontier line. But coastlines were something else. A field stays where it is. A coastline keeps escaping your view. It curves away, disappears beyond headlands, hides in mist, changes with every new bay, river mouth, shoal, and harbor. Land surveying could discipline territory. Coastlines would require a much messier alliance of sailors, memory, repeated voyages, and correction. Still, the ancient world was already building the tools that made later mapping possible. Mathematics, angular measurement, coordinates, procedures, the idea that space could be broken into reliable parts and then stitched back together again. Then, the Western Empire fractured, and the institutional continuity behind large-scale state mapping became uneven in Western Europe. The knowledge did not vanish, but it changed shape. And here is where most people get the story wrong. Medieval Europeans did not simply forget maps. They made different kinds of maps for different kinds of purposes. Some were not trying to guide a sailor or an army. They were trying to explain the world. That is the world of the Mappa Mundi, the maps of the world. At first glance, they can look strange to modern eyes. East might be at the top instead of north. Jerusalem might sit at the center. Biblical scenes, legends, peoples, creatures, and historical memory could share the page with rivers and continents. A famous surviving example, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, made around 1300 on a single sheet of vellum, was not a practical sailing chart. It was closer to a visual encyclopedia, a way of arranging geography, history, theology, and meaning into one image. But that does not mean these maps were careless. A medieval map maker still had to work like a craftsman. Parchment had to be prepared. Layout had to be ruled. Text and image had to be planned before the first serious stroke of ink. Place names had to be fitted into space. Pigments had to be mixed. On an expensive surface, every mistake hurt, and the method was still one of compilation. The maker did not travel the whole world. He gathered. He compared older texts, inherited sketches, reports, traditions, and authorities, then fused them into one coherent surface. In that sense, the medieval mapmaker was doing something deeply familiar, collecting fragments and trying to force them into a world-shaped whole. But symbolic maps could only go so far. A wall map in a cathedral could explain the world. It could not keep a ship off of a reef. And the sea does not care about symbolism. The sea only rewards accuracy. Elsewhere, other traditions pushed that practical side much harder. In the Islamic world, geography inherited and reworked Greek coordinate thinking, while also drawing on travelers, merchants, astronomers, and administrators. At the court of Roger II in Sicily, Muhammad al-Idrisi completed one of the great medieval geographic works in 1154. What matters is not just that he made a famous map, it is the method behind it, combining earlier scholarship with first-hand observation and eyewitness reports, then organizing that material into a more systematic description of the world. That is evidence being compared and filtered. In East Asia, too, mapmaking remained tied to administration, logistics, and technical thinking. Earlier Chinese traditions had already developed increasingly explicit ideas about scale and directional consistency, and by the 11th century, Shen Kuo's writings included the first known reference to the magnetic compass. That matters because once direction can be held more reliably, route knowledge becomes more stable, especially at sea. So, by the medieval period, several things were becoming clear. A map could be symbolic, administrative, scholarly, or practical. The real test came on water, because seas and oceans strip away illusion. On land, you can stop, ask, compare, and turn around. At sea, a small mistake does not stay small for long. In an age without GPS, and long before longitude could be measured reliably at sea, sailors had to survive with partial truths. Direction could be estimated from the sun, stars, and later, the compass. Distance had to be guessed from speed and time. That method, dead reckoning, was not random. You hold a heading, estimate how fast you are moving, count the hours, and update your position. But if current or wind has been lying to you, your map and your body begin drifting apart. Near shore, sailors looked for harder facts. A leadsman could cast a weighted line and read the depth by marks along the rope. Some leads were prepared to bring up sand or mud from the bottom, letting sailors identify not just how deep the water was, but what kind of seabed lay beneath them. Depth, bottom texture, familiar capes, harbor entrances, and the shape of hills inland all became clues. And now we reach the real heart of the problem: coastlines. How do you draw one without ever seeing it whole? You do not draw it all at once. You build it from repeated approach. A ship leaves port and sails along a known stretch of coast. The pilot notes the bearing to the next headland, estimates the distance, remembers where the bay opens, where the water shallows, where a harbor is safe, where a reef sits like a trap. Another crew sails the same leg later and confirms some of it, disputes some of it, adds a cove, a shoal, a promontory, a river mouth. A chart maker on land receives these fragments, compares them, steps distances with dividers, fixes them against a directional framework, and slowly the coast begins to harden on parchment, not seen from above, reconstructed from below, cape by cape, harbor by harbor, voyage by voyage. This is what makes the great medieval sea charts so impressive. In Europe, the clearest surviving examples of such charts are the Portolan charts that appear from around 1300 onward. Their defining web of rum lines radiates across the surface, giving navigators a directional framework tied to wind or compass points. These charts concentrated on what sailors actually needed: coastlines, ports, hazards, bearings, distances. Their place names often ran perpendicular to the coast, so the chart could be turned and still read along the shore. They were practical objects, shaped by use. And for their time, they were remarkably accurate, especially in heavily traveled waters like the Mediterranean. Trade kept forcing correction after correction. The more a coast was sailed, the more it could be argued over. The more it was argued over, the less it remained guesswork. But the limitations were still there. If your distances are estimated, small errors accumulate. If your heading is magnetic rather than perfectly true, drift accumulates. If a coast is rarely visited, it stays vague. And without a reliable solution to longitude, east to west precision at sea remains unstable. That's why, on some maps, we can see how much it relates to nowadays in the center, and the further we go, it becomes more of a guess. So even the best medieval charts were not magic. They were disciplined patchworks, extraordinary ones, but patchworks all the same. Then, something important returned to Europe from a different direction. Ptolemy came back. His geography, long marginal in Latin Europe, was translated into Latin in around the 15th century. That mattered because it reintroduced a powerful habit of thought. Coordinates, grids, projection, construction by framework. Now, mapmakers had two strong traditions, side by side. One grew out of practice, voyage, and repeated correction. The other grew out of theory, coordinates, and systematic placement. A coastline was no longer just a line to inherit. It was something you could revise, defend, and rebuild within a larger system. If medieval mapping was a tug of war between compilation and practical craft, the early modern world is where something begins to lock into place. Surveying becomes an engine. Maps start behaving like instruments. The crucial leap is triangulation. Instead of trusting a traveler's estimate for every distance, you begin with one measured baseline. Then, from each end of that line, you measure the angles to a distant point. Geometry does the rest. Distances you never physically walked can now be calculated. Space stops being only reported. It starts being solved. Gemma Fresius described this method in 1533, and over time, it became central to major state surveys. From there, entire countries could be pulled into geometric networks. In France, the Cassini family's work helped produce the first systematic national survey map based on triangulation. In Britain, the trigonometrical survey laid the foundation for what became the Ordnance Survey. These were no longer maps built mainly from inherited reports and route fragments, but the oldest terror of navigation still remained: longitude at sea. In 1714, Britain passed the Longitude Act, offering rewards for workable solutions. Two broad paths completed. One was astronomical. Use the moon and stars and compare measured angles against published tables to determine time at a known reference point. The other was mechanical. Carry that reference time with you aboard ship in an accurate clock. John Harrison devoted decades to that second path, building timekeepers precise enough to make longitude practical at sea. That sounds technical, but the underlying logic is simple and brutal. If local noon tells you your own time, and a trusted clock tells you the time somewhere else, the difference between those two times tells you how far east or west you are. At last, one of the oldest weaknesses in mapmaking begins to close. Sea charts can be corrected more precisely. Coastlines can be tied into larger coordinate systems. The patchwork starts becoming a framework. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world was being mapped through a vast alliance of geometry, astronomy, instruments, paperwork, states, ships, and enormous human labor. Men hauled equipment across mountains, along deserts, through forests, across coasts. The map still did not come from seeing the whole world from above. It came from relentless measurement and correction on the ground. Maps were not simply drawn, but assembled. A scribe marks a field. A surveyor lays out a road. A mathematician measures an angle. A sailor notes a headland. A chartmaker compares conflicting reports. A later survey cuts through old errors. And slowly, across generations, the world is measured. You can now explore our maps in even more detail as prints and downloads. Premium historical maps designed by historians. Link below.